I'll never forget that Saturday afternoon. It was one of those moments you don't see coming, an instant that ends up changing everything. I'd spent most of the morning in the house, straightening up, clearing out some junk. Maria had been away for work that week, so Sophie and I were just settling into our usual weekend routine. She was out front, kicking her little pink soccer ball around the yard, and I was looking through the car for the grocery receipt we'd lost. I'll be honest, I hadn't paid much attention at first. I was half kneeling on the back seat, moving my hand around under piles of jackets, loose bags, and a few things Sophie had tossed back there when I felt something odd, something small and crinkly between the seat cushions. I figured it was one of Sophie's half-wrapped candies or maybe an old wrapper that had slipped out of Maria's purse. But when I pulled it out, there was a condom, one of those things you can't mistake. I sat there, frozen. My mind was a blank. I blinked, thinking maybe I'd just seen it wrong, that there was some other explanation, some rational, reasonable answer that would click into place if I gave it a second. But the longer I stared, the heavier it felt in my hand. The car around me felt stifling, and suddenly I was aware of my own breathing. Slow, heavy, uncertain. I flipped it over, almost like I was hoping it would reveal something else, something innocent, something that would erase that sinking feeling already settling in my gut. Maybe it was a stupid prank. Maybe Maria had picked up someone else's stuff by accident. But my mind kept churning up all the wrong explanations. And suddenly, the past few months flashed before me in disjointed images. Maria's late nights, the phone that she kept close at all times, even in the bathroom, the far-off look she'd get when I asked about her day. I put it back, sinking into the seat, feeling the weight of it in my mind as I tried to take a steady breath. It was nothing, right? There was a simple reason for it. That was the only thing I allowed myself to think as I pulled my phone from my pocket, intending to ask Maria about it in a text and clear it all up. But my fingers hovered over the screen, refusing to type. I was afraid of the answer, afraid that maybe this wasn't some innocent misunderstanding. Just then, I heard Sophie's laugh outside, pure and unbothered, her little voice floating in the air. It brought me back to reality, to the feeling of her soft little hand when I'd help her get ready for bed, the way she'd hug me tight and tell me I was the best dad in the world. Whatever this condom was, it didn't matter. I told myself that I didn't want to know. I would be wrong. There was no way Maria, the woman I'd trusted with everything, would betray me like that. I shoved it deep into the pocket of my jacket, forcing my mind back to finding the stupid receipt. But all day, the unease stayed with me, the doubt gnawing quietly beneath the surface. The more I tried to ignore it, the louder it grew, filling in the silence with unanswered questions. That night, as I lay in bed beside her, every inch of my body felt tense, every small shift of the sheets making me feel like I was balancing on a cliff. Maria drifted off to sleep easily, her breathing soft, even, as if she didn't have a care in the world. I, on the other hand, lay there awake, staring into the darkness, one word repeating in my mind like a drumbeat. Why? I finally slipped out of bed around 3, pacing through the dark house, the dim glow of streetlights leaking through the blinds. I couldn't shake the memory of that feeling, the dread that seeped into my bones. I found myself back in the kitchen, the envelope with the receipt I'd been looking for earlier in my hand. I stared down at it, feeling stupid for letting something as small as a single wrapper shake me this badly. But I couldn't let it go. It was like a weight pressing against my chest, tightening with every second. Before I knew it, I was standing in front of her car again, back under that same dim overhead light, my hand gripping the door handle. I slipped back into the car, the smell of her perfume faint in the cold air, and I just sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at nothing. There were 1,000 explanations I could make up, each one fading in and out like ghosts. Finally, I pulled out my phone. I didn't want to look, didn't want to start checking up on her, becoming the kind of husband who pries through his wife's things. But the seed of doubt was already planted, growing stronger with every beat of my heart. The calm, trusting version of me was gone, a memory that felt more like a lie. That was the moment, right then, when I knew something had shifted. That simple trust, that comfort of knowing she was mine and I was hers, that was slipping through my fingers like water. I sat there, feeling my own breaths filling the stillness, feeling that gnawing dread coil tighter in my chest. I couldn't go back to the way things had been. The next few days felt like walking through quicksand, each step pulling me down into questions I didn't want to answer. I told myself to let it go, to act normal, but it was as if that single discovery had infected everything in my life. Maria moved around the house like she always did, with that easy smile that had once made everything feel so simple. But now, all I could see were the cracks. That Monday, she was rushing to get out the door for work, moving from room to room like a gust of wind. Sophie was wrapped around my leg, giggling as I tried to finish her cereal, and Maria blew us a distracted kiss. Big day, she called over her shoulder, slinging her bag across her chest. I might be late tonight. There's a conference call, maybe dinner after with the team. I nodded, swallowing the tight feeling in my throat. It wasn't unusual for her to be late. Her work had always kept her busy. But now I couldn't stop wondering if she was just busy with work, or something, or someone else. The condom flashed in my mind like a warning light, that cold plastic reminder I'd tried to bury deep. Maria left in her usual flurry of movement, the front door swinging shut behind her. Sophie ran off to play, leaving me in the heavy silence. I glanced at my phone, my fingers itching to text her, to ask where she'd really be tonight. But I pushed the thought away. If I started questioning every move she made, there would be no going back. I'd turn into the kind of man who looked over his shoulder, who hovered suspiciously over his own wife's phone, doubting every word. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. All day, as I sat at work, every conversation seemed to fade into a fog of distracted thoughts. My mind drifted to Maria and every moment in the last year when she'd been somewhere else. The phone calls she took in the other room, the messages she'd flip face down if I walked by. There were little things I'd noticed but brushed off, small inconsistencies that, on their own, had seemed like nothing. But now, together, they felt like flashing signs, pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. When I got home, the house was quiet. Sophie was still with her babysitter, and Maria had texted, saying she'd be later than she'd thought. I barely glanced at the message, my mind drifting to my jacket pocket. I pulled out the condom, holding it between my fingers, examining it again as if some answer might leap out at me. The room felt heavy, like all the air had gone stale. Finally, I put it away. Sitting down on the couch, I could feel my frustration growing. I'd always been the one to let things go, to forgive quickly, and to trust fully. Maybe it was my own fault for never doubting her. But now that it was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Later, Maria came home, her face flushed from the cold outside, smiling as she dropped her things on the counter. "Sorry for the late night," she said, breezing into the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water. "Work was just a lot." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Big conference call?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, casual. "Yeah," she replied quickly, too quickly. "And then just a quick dinner with a few people. It's been a long day." Her answers were simple, her expression relaxed, but that tightening in my gut didn't loosen. Every instinct told me to let it drop, to act like I always had. I wanted to believe her, to take her words as the truth, but I felt a sharp pang of suspicion. I realized I'd been holding my breath, waiting for something, some slip, some crack in her words that would make it all make sense. But nothing came. Maria chatted with Sophie, tucked her in for bed, and sat down beside me on the couch, her usual smile in place. She even reached for my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. Yet, the warmth that had always been there between us felt distant, as if something was blocking it, something I couldn't quite reach. I finally let out a shaky breath, knowing I had to say something. "You've been out a lot lately," I began, choosing my words carefully. "Work keeping you that busy?" Maria's smile faltered, just barely, and then she laughed, shrugging it off. "Yeah, I guess it has been a little crazy," she said, giving my hand a squeeze. "But it's just for now. You know how these things go. I'll make it up to you soon." The words sounded right, but the hesitation in her smile made them feel hollow. I nodded, swallowing my doubts. "I get it," I replied softly, trying to ignore the tightening in my chest. But after she went to bed, I found myself on the couch, staring at the ceiling, going over her words again and again. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe it was all a mistake. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. Something unspoken and ugly that lurked beneath every word. And as I sat there alone in the darkness, I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't going away. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing faster than I could contain it. A few days after that strange conversation with Maria, the questions started to get louder, pressing at the edges of my mind with an intensity one couldn't ignore. It was like a slow poison, spreading from one part of my life into every corner, making even the most ordinary moments feel suspicious. I kept trying to silence it, telling myself that I was being paranoid, that this was just a blip in our marriage. But the more I pushed it away, the more it pushed back. That Friday, Maria was supposed to be out of town for work again, some kind of off-site retreat with her team. She left early, suitcase in hand, blowing me a quick kiss on her way out the door. "I'll miss you guys," she'd said, ruffling Sophie's hair with a smile. "Back late Sunday, all right?" I'd smiled, waved, and kissed her goodbye, trying to keep the warmth in my eyes, trying to feel normal. But the second she pulled out of the driveway, I felt a heaviness settle over me, a weight I couldn't shake. I watched her car until it disappeared around the corner, and that nagging feeling clawed at me, relentless and ruthless. For a few hours, I tried to ignore it. I took Sophie to the park, watched her race around the playground with other kids, her laughter lifting into the sky, pure and carefree. I watched her play, wondering how much of my worry showed on my face, trying to keep up my end of the play date even though my mind was 1,000 miles away. But when we got back home, Sophie took off to her room, and I found myself alone in the kitchen. And that's when I saw it. Maria's work laptop, the one she'd forgotten on the counter, her email still open on the screen. My breath caught, my mind filling with conflicting thoughts. I knew this was a line I hadn't crossed before. We had always respected each other's privacy, but this wasn't about privacy anymore. This was about answers. I stared at the screen, hesitating, my heart pounding in my chest. It was one thing to think about digging for the truth. It was another to actually reach for it. I took a deep breath, a part of me screaming to walk away, to leave it alone. But then my hand moved on its own, almost as if someone else were controlling it, and I scrolled through her inbox, scanning quickly. Most of the emails were routine, work-related, back-and-forth exchanges about presentations and projects. But just as I was about to close the laptop and try to forget this whole thing, a new message popped up, and the subject line stopped me cold. "Tonight." It was from a man named Colin, a name that didn't belong to anyone I knew in her office, or anyone I'd heard her mention before. I hesitated, my heart thudding so loudly that it seemed to echo off the walls. The email itself was short, almost cryptic, and every word felt like a slap to the face. "Looking forward to tonight. Same place as usual." I stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. The words were innocent enough on their own, but in the context of everything I'd been feeling, they took on a darker meaning. Same place as usual? What place? And why would a coworker use that tone? I sat there, my hands gripping the edges of the counter, trying to convince myself that it was harmless, that I was overreacting. But every logical explanation crumbled under the weight of my suspicions. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to find any reasonable scenario that would make sense of this, but none came. After a few seconds, I stood up, feeling like the room was spinning. I grabbed my phone and did something I'd never thought I'd do. I started typing the address of that off-site retreat into the hotel's booking system. A few clicks later, my stomach lurched as the screen showed no reservations found. There was nothing under her name, nothing in her company's name either. I leaned against the counter, the air thick around me. I could barely breathe. It was as if everything I knew was unraveling, slipping through my fingers. I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to scream, to throw something, to do anything to release the unbearable tension tightening in my chest. Finally, I dialed Maria's number, my fingers trembling as I hit call. It rang once, twice, and then she answered, her voice bright and cheerful, as if she weren't carrying a secret that threatened to tear our life apart. "Hey, babe," she said, her tone light, casual. "How's it going? How's Sophie?" "Sophie's good," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you all settled in?" "Yeah," she replied, but I could hear something in her voice, a hesitation. "We're just getting set up, unpacking. It's all business here, but you know how these things go." I bit my lip, feeling anger and hurt swell within me. "Where exactly are you staying again?" I asked, trying to keep my tone as innocent as possible. There was a brief pause, just a beat too long, and then she laughed. "Oh, the usual place. I told you. It's just a lot of meetings and presentations, nothing exciting." The words cut through me, sharp and cold. She didn't realize that I already knew the truth. She didn't know that her lie was hanging in the air, exposed and raw, its jagged edges leaving wounds she couldn't see. "Well," I said slowly, forcing myself to keep my voice calm, "I hope you enjoy it. Let me know if you need anything, all right?" "Of course," she replied, her voice warm, affectionate even. "Give Sophie a kiss for me. I'll be home soon." I ended the call and set the phone down, feeling my heart crack a little more. I couldn't keep denying it. The truth was there, in her words, in her actions, in every evasive look and every late night. The woman I'd trusted, the woman I'd loved with everything I had, was lying to me. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of betrayal settle over me like a dark cloud. All these years, I'd built my life around her, around the family we created. I'd loved her fully, completely, without reservation. And now, I felt like a stranger in my own life, lost in a world that didn't belong to me. That night, I sat alone in the dark, my mind racing, every memory of our time together tainted by the shadow of doubt. I thought about Sophie, asleep down the hall, innocent and blissfully unaware. My love for her was absolute, untouchable. But now, the seed of an unthinkable question took root, one I'd never thought I'd consider. Was Sophie really mine? I pushed the thought away, hating myself for even letting it enter my mind. But the truth was relentless, gnawing at me, demanding to be acknowledged. I sat there, drowning in anger, sadness, and betrayal, knowing that the life I'd known was slipping through my fingers, leaving nothing but shattered trust and unanswered questions in its wake. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, I made a decision I never thought I'd have to make. I would get a DNA test. I would find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt, no matter what it cost me. Because I couldn't live like this. I couldn't live in the shadow of lies, doubting everything, questioning every moment. I needed to know, once and for all. And so, with a heavy heart, I set the wheels in motion, feeling as if I were setting fire to my own life. I didn't know what the truth would bring, but I knew that whatever it was, there was no going back. The thought of a DNA test gnawed at me. The idea was so absurd, so surreal, I felt ridiculous even considering it. But that email, Maria's voice on the phone, the way she'd lied so smoothly, all of it sat heavy in my chest, turning my thoughts darker and darker. I knew I wouldn't have peace until I had answers. The next morning, I found myself up early, pacing the kitchen as Sophie ate her cereal. She chatted happily about school, her words background noise to the storm in my head. I kept glancing at her, noticing her little features, the way her eyes lit up when she talked, her soft laugh. My heart ached. This was my girl, the child I'd raised, yet I couldn't shake the doubt. "Daddy," she asked, pulling me back to the moment. "Are you okay?" I forced a smile, reaching out to brush a hand over her hair. "Yes, sweetie. Daddy's just thinking." But my heart felt bruised, and I could barely stand looking at her, my little girl, with this terrible doubt clouding everything. That day, I couldn't focus on anything. I went through the motions at work, hearing only snippets of conversations around me, my mind in a fog. By the time I got home, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I'd already looked up a testing clinic nearby. If I left the question unanswered, it would eat away at me, turning every moment with Sophie into another question, another ache. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, I took a quiet moment to sit in my office and stare at the test request form I'd filled out online. My finger hovered over the submit button for what felt like an eternity. It felt wrong. The act of pressing that button felt like a betrayal of my family, like I was admitting defeat. But then I remembered that condom and Maria's cold lie over the phone. If she could betray me this deeply, I had a right to know the truth. Finally, I clicked submit. The instructions were simple, but the steps felt surreal. I'd have to collect a DNA sample, both from me and from Sophie, then bring it to the lab. That night, I barely slept, replaying my decision over and over. Part of me wanted to back out. This was Sophie, the little girl who ran into my arms every evening, who trusted me with her whole heart. What if it turned out that she wasn't biologically mine? Could I still look at her the same way? Could I even live with that knowledge? The next morning, I gathered my sample and prepared to collect Sophie's when she came to ask for help with her shoes. Her tiny feet dangled as I knelt to tie them, and she smiled up at me, oblivious to the battle raging inside my head. My hands shook as I tied the laces, my mind tormented by the thought of hurting her, hurting us. But I had to know. I couldn't live in the shadow of Maria's betrayal, wondering if my whole life was built on a lie. When I collected Sophie's sample, she didn't question it, thinking it was just a game or some silly dad task. I hated myself a little for putting her through it, but I'd come too far to stop. After she left for school, I drove to the clinic, feeling like I was walking to my own funeral. My hands felt cold as I passed the samples to the lab tech, who took them with a warm smile that felt completely out of place. The waiting began that night, and it nearly drove me to the edge. Every interaction with Sophie felt different, tainted by this dark question. I avoided her gaze, which made her seem even more worried. I could see her watching me, her little face clouded with confusion, as if she knew something was wrong, but couldn't figure out what. The guilt sat like a weight on my chest, pressing down every time she called me daddy. A few days later, I got the email I'd been dreading. The results were ready. I sat there, my finger hovering over the link, heart pounding as I thought about what might be on the other side. What if she wasn't mine? I'd never be able to unsee it, never go back to the life we'd had. But I clicked it. I held my breath, reading the lines as my heart pounded so loudly I could barely think. One line in particular seemed to jump off the screen, hauntingly cold and definitive. Paternity excluded. I felt like the ground had given way beneath me. Every part of me went numb. Sophie wasn't biologically mine. My little girl, my whole world, was another man's daughter. I closed the email, my hands shaking, struggling to breathe. I'd never felt so betrayed, so utterly broken. This was Maria's lie, her secret that had torn everything apart, leaving me hollow and alone. And in that moment, I knew there was only one thing left to do. After the DNA results, my world went silent. I thought the truth would bring me peace, some kind of answer, maybe even a chance to rebuild. But it was like opening a door into a void I could never close again. Sophie wasn't mine. That single fact settled in my chest like a stone, crushing any thoughts of pretending, of fixing what was broken. I waited until Maria got home that evening, my hands fisted tight as I watched her walk in, full of her usual, casual warmth. She dropped her bag by the door and smiled, giving Sophie a big hug before finally turning to me with that same, practiced look I'd taken for granted. But I couldn't let it pass this time. I'd been playing the fool for long enough. "Can we talk?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Sophie looked up from her toys on the floor, her wide eyes flicking between us. "Just the two of us," I added gently, giving Sophie a reassuring smile. Maria's smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she forced her expression back to neutral. "Of course," she said, setting her purse down. I nodded toward the hallway, and we walked to the bedroom in silence, each step feeling like the walk to a battlefield. The door closed behind us, and she leaned against it, crossing her arms. "What's wrong, Alex?" she asked, but her voice had a hint of something sharper, almost defensive, like she already sensed what was coming. I took a deep breath, feeling the betrayal and anger coil tight within me. I was done playing nice, done hiding the truth. "Maria," I began, my voice taut. Who is Sophie's father? The color drained from her face, but she tried to brush it off with a nervous laugh. What are you talking about? You're Sophie's father. Why would you even ask something like that? My hands shook as I pulled out the printed DNA report, thrusting it toward her. I had a DNA test done. I know, Maria. I know I'm not her biological father. Her face crumpled. I watched her defenses collapse, her body slumping against the door as her mouth opened and closed, searching for words that wouldn't come. Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't feel sympathy for her. Not now. Not after this. Alex, I can explain, she stammered, the tears spilling over. Then explain it, I said, my voice cold and low. Explain how you could let me believe that Sophie was mine for all these years. How you could lie to me about something like this. She looked down, wringing her hands, and finally managed to speak. It was a mistake, Alex. I never meant for this to happen. She wiped her cheeks, her voice breaking. I didn't even know if I should tell you. I was scared. I thought if I kept it to myself, we could move on. A mistake, I repeated, my voice rising. Maria, this isn't just some mistake you make and then hide. This is a life. This is a child you let me raise without telling me the truth. She shook her head, sobbing. I know it was wrong. But I was afraid you'd leave me if you found out, and Sophie, she deserves a father who loves her. I felt a sharp pang of anger and betrayal flare inside me. Do you realize what you've done, Maria? Do you know what it feels like to raise a child, to love her, and then find out that you were just a fallback plan? That you've been used? She tried to reach out, but I stepped back, keeping a wall between us. Please, Alex, she pleaded, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry, but Sophie is yours in every way that matters. Except the one way that does matter, I said bitterly. She's my daughter, yes, but I have the right to know if she's mine or not. You stole that from me. Her shoulders slumped, her face crumpling with fresh tears, and I watched her crumble, feeling nothing but hollow, empty anger. Tell me the truth, I demanded, my voice rough. Was it just one affair, or were there others? She bit her lip, glancing away, and her silence was answer enough. The depth of her betrayal hit me like a wave, and I had to steady myself against the dresser. This was the woman I'd trusted, the woman I'd built my life with. And now, that life was in ruins. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. It was just once. He was an old friend, someone I thought I could confide in when things were tough between us. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. I tried to end it, but then I found out I was pregnant. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep the anger from boiling over, but I felt like a stranger in my own home. She had lied to me for years, let me believe that Sophie was mine, and then, somehow, expected to keep that secret forever. What did you expect, Maria? I said, the bitterness thick in my voice. That I would just never find out? That you could hide this forever? I don't know, she whispered, her face streaked with tears. I was wrong. I know that. I was just scared. I didn't want to lose you. I shook my head, unable to look at her any longer. Well, you lost me anyway. I left the room without another word, the hollow silence following me as I walked down the hall. Sophie was still in the living room, coloring with her crayons, her small face lighting up when she saw me. Daddy, she called, running over to wrap her arms around my legs. I picked her up, holding her close, feeling her warmth against me, but my heart was torn in two. She wasn't my daughter, not by blood, but in that moment, none of that mattered. She was my little girl, and no test could take that away. But as I held her, I knew that my life with Maria was over. The trust we'd built was gone, shattered beyond repair, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had turned to ashes. The days that followed that confrontation with Maria were a haze of anger, heartbreak, and numbness. I went to work, went through the motions with Sophie, but inside, I felt hollow. It was like a part of me had gone quiet, leaving behind only the sound of everything that had come undone. And each day, as I watched Maria moving around the house like a ghost, I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep living in a life built on lies. One morning, I woke up before dawn. I sat in the kitchen, staring into my coffee as the house filled with the first faint light of day. Maria came in, moving quietly, her eyes red from nights of restless sleep and silent guilt. We hadn't talked much since that night. Every time she tried, I shut her down, knowing that there was nothing left to say. The trust was gone, shredded beyond repair. "Alex," she whispered, her voice fragile, tentative. "Please, can we try to talk?" I took a slow breath, gripping the coffee mug as I looked up at her. I could see the regret in her eyes, the plea that we could somehow get through this, but I knew that wasn't possible. "What's left to say, Maria?" I asked, my voice calm but hollow. "You kept the biggest secret of our lives from me. There's no coming back from that." Her shoulders sagged, and she nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm so sorry, Alex," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to destroy everything." "It doesn't matter anymore," I replied, feeling the words sit like stones in my chest. "You made your choice a long time ago. I just didn't know it until now." I stood up, leaving her there, knowing that if I stayed, I'd drown in all the things I could never forgive. I went to my office, closed the door, and took a long, steadying breath. I opened my laptop, my hands still shaking as I searched for a divorce lawyer. Just seeing the word divorce in black and white made everything real. I thought about the life I'd built, the family I'd fought so hard to protect, and the weight of loss hit me like a punch to the gut. But the anger kept me going, the betrayal fueling me with a determination I'd never felt before. Within an hour, I'd made the call, setting an appointment with a lawyer who came highly recommended. The divorce process was starting, and with each step, I felt the life I'd known slipping further and further away. I was about to untangle myself from the woman I'd once loved with everything I had, the woman I'd trusted more than anyone in the world. But now, that woman was just a stranger. Later that night, Maria tried to talk to me again, her voice fragile and pleading. She wanted to make things work, to go to counseling, to somehow patch over the gaping wounds she'd left. But I couldn't find a way to respond. Her apologies sounded like noise, meaningless and hollow, echoing off walls that had once held laughter, love, and promises. I told her, calmly but firmly, that I'd filed for divorce. Her face fell, her eyes wide with horror, as the reality of it finally sank in. "No, Alex, please," she whispered, reaching for my hand, her voice breaking. "We can work through this. For Sophie's sake, we can try." I pulled my hand away, my voice low. "You didn't give me a chance to decide that, Maria. You took that from me. And now, there's nothing left. I'm sorry, but I can't live like this." Her face crumpled, and I watched her walk away, feeling nothing but a strange, quiet acceptance. There was a sense of finality in that moment, a knowing that the life we'd built was gone, as dead as the trust we'd shared. The days after that conversation moved slowly, each one a blur of papers, lawyers, and questions. I kept my mind focused on the legal process, on making arrangements for Sophie, because the alternative, sitting alone with my thoughts, was too much to bear. Each night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had all come to this. Wondering how a love that had once felt like everything could end so completely. One evening, I was sitting in Sophie's room, watching her sleep, her tiny form curled up with her favorite stuffed bear. I brushed a hand over her hair, my heart swelling with love and sorrow. No test, no betrayal could ever change the fact that she was my daughter, the child I'd raised, the little girl who had my whole heart. In that moment, I made a promise to myself and to her. No matter what happened between me and Maria, I would always be there for Sophie. She might not share my DNA, but she shared my heart, and I'd do everything in my power to protect her, to be the dad she deserved. I kissed her forehead softly, whispering, "I'll always be here for you, sweetheart, no matter what." The divorce paperwork arrived 2 weeks later, a heavy envelope that felt like the weight of my entire life shoved into a manila folder. I sat at the dining table, reading each line with numb detachment, signing where I needed to, and handing it all to the lawyer. By the time I was done, I felt exhausted, drained of everything I'd once been. That night, Maria moved into the guest room. We didn't speak much after that, only about the arrangements for Sophie, the division of our things, the logistics of ending a marriage. But as the final papers were filed, as our life unraveled before my eyes, I felt something unexpected, a sense of relief, a strange lightness beneath all the sadness. I knew I was losing everything I'd known, but in that loss, there was a freedom too, a chance to rebuild, to start fresh. The day we both signed the final divorce decree, I walked out of the courthouse, feeling the cold bite of winter against my skin. The world felt empty, but in a way, that emptiness was a gift. It was a clean slate, a chance to let go of the betrayal, the lies, and the heartbreak, and to find a way forward. And as I took that first step into a life without Maria, I knew that while it would be hard, I'd survive. I'd find a way to heal, for Sophie, and for myself. Because in the end, I was free. The house was quiet, almost unbearably so, the day Maria left. We'd spent the past few days packing her things, dividing our lives into two separate paths, each box a reminder of the years we were leaving behind. The wedding photos were carefully tucked away in a box bound for storage. I'd seen her hesitate over them, her hand lingering, before she'd packed them without a word. It was as if we both knew that no memory, no photograph could mend what was already broken. She was loading the last few things in her car when Sophie came rushing out, her face lighting up at the sight of her mom. "Where are you going, Mommy?" she asked, her little voice full of excitement, oblivious to the finality in the air. Maria knelt down, forcing a smile, her eyes darting to me before she turned back to Sophie. "Mommy has to go away for a little while, sweetie," she said gently, brushing a hand over Sophie's hair. "But you'll see me soon, okay?" Sophie frowned, her brows knitting together. "Are you coming back?" There was a silence that stretched too long, a silence that seemed to echo off every wall of the home we'd once built together. Maria looked over at me, her eyes brimming with tears, but I couldn't find any words to comfort her. I was too numb, too drained to be anything other than the quiet bystander, watching this last scene play out. "Yes, honey," Maria finally managed, her voice choked. "Mommy will come back to see you very soon." She pulled Sophie into a hug, her shoulders shaking as she held our little girl close, whispering words that I couldn't hear, words meant for only them. When she finally stood, there was nothing left to say. I walked with her to the car, Sophie by my side, her tiny hand gripping mine. Maria gave me one last look, a glance filled with regret, grief, and something else, maybe a wish that things had been different. But I could only nod, barely able to meet her eyes, already feeling the distance between us. "Take care," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then, with a shaky breath, she got in the car, her hands gripping the wheel tightly as she looked straight ahead. I watched her pull out of the driveway, Sophie waving after her until the car disappeared from view. When it was gone, an ache settled over me, a strange mixture of emptiness and relief. The house felt lighter somehow, like a wound that had finally been allowed to breathe. Sophie tugged at my hand, looking up at me with her big, questioning eyes. "Daddy, when will Mommy come back?" I knelt down, swallowing hard as I held her gaze. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said softly, feeling the weight of each word. "But you'll always have me. I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, seemingly satisfied, before throwing her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder. I held her close, feeling the warmth of her small body against mine, a reminder that not everything had been lost. We still had each other. Whatever Maria's choices had taken from me, they couldn't take that. The day faded into evening, the house growing dark around us, but I didn't mind the quiet. As Sophie drifted off to sleep in my arms, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt in weeks, hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there, reminding me that there was still life to be built, still love to give. I carried Sophie to her room, tucking her in and brushing a hand over her hair as she slept. "Good night, my girl," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. And as I stood there in the doorway, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I would be ready. We would be okay. In the weeks after Maria left, the house took on a new, quieter rhythm. The sounds of daily life, the clink of breakfast dishes, Sophie's laughter, the soft hum of the radio, felt different without her presence. I thought the empty spaces would haunt me, but instead, they became a canvas, a blank slate I could reclaim. Sophie, thankfully, adapted better than I'd expected. Children, I realized, have a way of holding on to joy that adults sometimes lose. She peppered me with questions now and then. When's mommy coming back? Or, will we all go to the zoo together again? But she didn't dwell on the silence Maria had left behind. And slowly, that helped me not dwell on it either. One Saturday morning, I decided we'd redecorate the house, something to give it a new life, a feeling of belonging just for the two of us. We cleared out the old knickknacks, rearranged furniture, and I even let Sophie pick out a bright, kid-sized armchair she'd been eyeing at the store. She chose purple, her favorite color in the whole world, and I couldn't help but laugh at how proud she looked, sitting in it with a grin that spread from ear to ear. There were moments, though, when the ache would return, a dull reminder of what had been. Sometimes, I catch myself expecting Maria to walk through the door, to make coffee in the morning, or to sit beside me after a long day. But each time, I reminded myself that these feelings were part of moving on, like ripples in a pond that would eventually calm. One evening, after putting Sophie to bed, I sat alone in the quiet of the living room, looking around at the small changes we'd made. The house didn't feel like a memory anymore. It was starting to feel like ours, a place where Sophie and I could create new traditions, new memories, ones untouched by betrayal or loss. I grabbed my phone and texted an old friend, someone I'd drifted from over the years as life took over. "Hey, it's been a while," I wrote, hitting send before I could overthink it. He replied quickly, his warmth and humor like a balm I hadn't realized I needed. As we talked, I felt something shift within me, a realization that I wasn't alone. I had Sophie, yes, but I also had people who cared, who had been waiting for me to reach out. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of connection, a reminder that there was a life beyond what had been. I looked around our little home, a faint smile playing at my lips. This new life, still fragile, felt like the first steps of something real, something steady. Starting over was terrifying, but for Sophie's sake, and for my own, I knew I could do it. We could do it. Life settled into something resembling normalcy. Each day began to feel lighter, filled with small routines Sophie and I built together. Mornings were our own little rituals. Pancakes on Saturdays, cartoons before school, and Sophie's giggles filling the air as we got ready. At first, the silence left by Maria was overwhelming. But as days passed, the quiet became something I could fill. I took up running again, something I hadn't done in years. It started as a way to clear my head, but soon it became a new source of strength. Each morning, I'd lace up my shoes, hit the trail, and run until my mind quieted, until the weight of the past felt just a little lighter. Sophie noticed the changes too. She'd smile up at me, her small hand slipping into mine as if sensing my need for connection. One evening, as we read her bedtime story, she rested her head on my shoulder and sighed. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered, a simple statement that anchored me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And it was more than just our routines. Friends I hadn't seen in years began reaching out. I found myself reconnecting with the world outside these walls, accepting invitations, and joining small gatherings that reminded me of who I was beyond the heartbreak. It was strange, sometimes remembering how it felt to laugh freely, to let go of the tension that had gripped me for so long. One night, I put Sophie to bed and stood alone by the window, looking out at the quiet street. I realized in that stillness that I was building something new, not a perfect life, not one without scars, but a life that was truly my own. And that was enough. Sophie and I were doing okay. And as I stared into the night, I felt something I hadn't felt in ages. Hope. Months passed, and with each one, the past faded a little more. Life wasn't perfect, but it felt solid, like I was walking on ground I'd built with my own hands. Sophie thrived in our new routine, her laughter a constant reminder that we were both healing. One Saturday, we spent the day at the park, just the two of us. She raced down the slide, her face alight with joy, and as I watched her, I felt a deep, quiet pride. She was my daughter, no matter what any piece of paper said. Our bond was unbreakable. At the end of the day, as we walked back home, she slipped her hand into mine and looked up at me. "Daddy, we're really happy, aren't we?" The simplicity of her question brought a lump to my throat. I smiled, squeezing her hand. "Yes, sweetie, we really are." As we walked, I thought about how far we'd come. Rebuilding had been a slow, sometimes painful process, but it had also been freeing. I'd started reaching for things I'd once enjoyed, reading again, cooking new recipes, even planning a small trip for Sophie and me. I'd come to realize that my life wasn't defined by Maria's choices. Her betrayal hurt, and the scars would always be there, but they no longer had the power to control me. I was more than what I'd lost. Back at home, I tucked Sophie in, kissed her forehead, and whispered goodnight. Standing in the doorway, I looked around the house, our home, filled with new memories and small joys that were only ours. There was peace in letting go, in knowing I didn't need all the answers to move forward. The love and stability I'd created for Sophie and myself were enough. And as I turned off the light and closed her door, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we were ready to face it. We were moving forward, one step at a time, together.